everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining today. Appreciate you taking out your time. And today is another exciting day because we have a fully packed session with an interesting topic as well for today's webinar. And today's webinar is all about API audit, enterprise audit strategy, and also some of the neat things that APIwiz has been working on in terms of observability, more specifically, how we can get observability into services using no code orchestration as well. And with me here today on the panel is James Higginbotham. Hi, James. Hope you're doing good.
Hi, Deeb. Yeah, thanks for having me. Doing great today.
Excellent. James, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an executive API consultant, which is just a fancy way of saying that I work with organizations globally to help them establish, grow, and mature their API programs. So I work with a lot of organizations to help train up their staff, get them prepared for how to consume and design APIs. And then I work with API offices, Center for Enablement, API guilds, usually reporting to the Office of the CIO to help them get their API program a little bit more formalized, help it to scale, introduce automation and other elements to the programs.
That's great. And also a bit about me for the audience. My name is Audit. I'm a pre-sales engineer at APIwiz. And at APIwiz, we're a SaaS company, and our mission is to make and help enterprises scale their API programs. And without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. And it's a pretty interesting one, James, because I think out of a lot of the problems that enterprises face with respect to their API program, one thing in particular is about service discoverability and the lack of visibility, which really creates a lot of other not just management challenges, but also challenges in terms of governance. Yeah. So, James, the first major point of discussion for today is why do enterprises really struggle so much with their API program today, and more specifically around service discoverability?
Yeah, I think a lot of the organizations that I work with, as I mentioned, I kind of help them sometimes establish a formalized API program. Some organizations struggle because there's a lot of APIs being built out today. A lot of the clients that I've worked with, they have hundreds to thousands of APIs, and they're producing them on a daily and weekly basis. They're launching new APIs. So in some cases, they don't even have that infrastructure, that formality of their program simply to track and catalog everything that they've built. They're quickly standing up services, standing up APIs and putting them out there. They may just be internal APIs. It may not necessarily be something that's externally facing, but we also see that as well. Mobile and web apps and the APIs that power those and partner integration and so on. So there's a big challenge in kind of getting the program established in a way that helps you to track those APIs so that they don't go hidden and start to become a source of malicious use, and making sure that they're secured and properly managed. So a lot of organizations today are just going at such a quick velocity delivering APIs that some of them are losing track of the APIs that they have, or that teams have deployed APIs out in the past and they get forgotten. So a lot of those lead to a lack of insight into the API program itself and what's out there, and maybe leading to some APIs that are unsecured and sitting out there available for malicious use.
Yeah, that's exactly right, James. In fact, the point you mentioned about internal API sprawl, that's particularly significant across a lot of the enterprises today, and also why they're not able to really capitalize on those. It's really the services that have been built up through years and years, maybe even decades of I wouldn't call it negligence, but just APIs do pick up pace and they really proliferate pretty quickly. So yeah, that leads me to my next question, James. So speaking about API sprawl and the rate at which APIs grow internally as well as externally for partner consumption, how would you say that enterprises really audit their APIs today?
Some of them are doing that. Some of them aren't even really don't have API audits on their radar, unfortunately. But there are some organizations that I've worked with that their enterprise infrastructure is really good at preventing APIs from being exposed externally, and that at least limits their ability to push APIs out without having them cataloged and reviewed by some kind of API Center for Enablement, or an API COE, Center of Excellence, something similar to that. In other cases, organizations are starting to realize that developers have been building and developing APIs for years, and they have not really had any kind of formal governance or oversight of them. And so it's left them vulnerable. And in that case, what they're doing is they're doing a lot of manual work. They're spending a lot of time, oftentimes handing around spreadsheets and things to catalog the APIs that some of those have documentation. And so they're able to leverage and share the API documentation that's been built, usually in the Open API specification format, or what we used to call Swagger. And, other times it's maybe just a list that someone has. They might be aware of the APIs that they have. But that's the challenge that they face is that that doesn't always find everything that's out there. So it also takes a lot of time and effort. So there's definitely some initiatives out there with a lot of my clients to try to get a hold of their API program and start to audit what they have and determine which ones are secured, what gateway are they on, what are the security rules that have been applied to it. And oftentimes it's a manual process, and that's very difficult for these organizations to get done.
Yeah, that's true, James. In fact, I would say that some of the significant consequences of this lack of visibility would be, right up front would be, it's very difficult to integrate the services when you don't have a visibility, and even the potential risks that these, particularly the undocumented microservices have. They could use outdated security mechanisms, or just have potential vulnerabilities in them that could really compromise your whole critical systems and subsystems. So I'd say it's it's really of relevance today to have a proper API audit strategy. But that brings me to my next question, James, because API audit is not new. Enterprises have certainly tried it before, but we also see that there have been a number of failures as opposed to successes. So if we had to maybe subjectify that and say, what are the top reasons that these endeavors usually fail, James? What would come to your mind?
Yeah, when I engage with a lot of organizations, the enterprise IT groups are typically overwhelmed with the number of APIs that they have, and they're trying to get a hold of it. One of the things that I've seen really become an important element of success of an API program is executive sponsorship and executive support. So in some cases, a lot of enterprises have had to kind of start bottom up and try to figure out how to audit their APIs and establish a little bit more formality around them so that they can govern them. Just a lightweight governance so that we know what APIs we have, and we have a clear process by which API through its life cycle all the way to where it's delivered and being managed. So oftentimes executive sponsorship either will make or break those initiatives. If we're trying to audit a series of APIs and we need to invest that kind of resource, investment into the process, having executives there to say, we see this as important. We realize that one, there's an opportunity to reuse APIs. And so having a catalog of our APIs and making sure that we have identified all of them can speed up our delivery, and we're not repeating ourselves, building the same API over and over again in every group. It also ensures that the audit process will come to completion and be able to expose any kind of concerns that might exist with APIs that are out there today, like we said, not secured or not fully configured properly for the security rules that need to be implemented. I also see sometimes a shift in priorities. So one time we saw an API audit begin to emerge, and then all of a sudden, this other initiative, this other opportunity came up, became more important, and so the API audit was set off to the side. And so in that case, it became a very difficult situation where we had begun the API audit process, had to set it off to the side. We had some list of APIs, but we weren't able to get them all cataloged. So ensuring that you have prioritization of that audit process and of your API program will ensure that you have the right level of checks and balances in the organization to make sure that you can do more with less, that you can find the APIs that you need when you need them, and you can have the confidence to ensure that they're properly configured and secured, and you can even automate those checks. So a lot of times, shifting in priorities and API programs not becoming high priority in some organizations can lead to a lot of difficulties in that audit process and in the API program overall. The last thing that I see is just the amount of time it takes to do those manual audits. So a lot of organizations will say, I'd love to do this, but I just really don't have the amount of time or the budget or the people that I can spare to go through this process. I need everybody all hands on deck working on something that we have that needs to be delivered. So in that case, sometimes the budget and the resources become starved for the API program or for that API audit initiative. And that will kind of cause these kinds of initiatives to fail or to take quite a bit of time to be able to be delivered.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, James. In fact, two of the key points that you did mention about the executive sponsorship and even the time cost of this effort, not just in terms of not just in terms of money, but also in terms of time. I'd say because it takes, it could span somewhere from several months to years. Would you say that would be some of the significant challenges why it's difficult to get a sponsorship for such an activity? Because time spent on something like a non-functional task is also time taken away from innovation.
Yeah, I see that. I see it quite often. It's sometimes hard to justify. Exists API C4Es, COEs will start the initiative or look to get approval to undergo that initiative because it requires a lot of cooperation across the organization and it requires a lot of socialization as well. And so it can take time. I know that in some of the initiatives that I've been involved in, whether it's API audits or establishing and unifying on standards and practices and things, oftentimes there's different groups around the organization, maybe even different lines of businesses or business units, and they operate independently or semi-independently. And so you have to spend a lot of time convincing those other groups to participate in the exercise, to get the list of APIs, to start to unify on the program, to start to secure the APIs consistently through consistent application of security configurations across gateways and so on. So it can take months and sometimes years and millions of dollars to make it happen. I've been involved with some organizations that are structured not functionally, but rather by product area, either because they're a product company with multiple lines of products. Some of them might deal in hardware, some in software, some as software as a service, some as on-premises software. Whatever the case is, they might have themselves organized where each group has its own set of executives. Each product line has its own set of executives. And you're trying to unify the API initiative and try to get at the experience across those product lines to be a little bit more consistent for developers. So I'm not using OAuth 2 to authenticate and authorize access to an API by one group, and the other one's using ID and password and clear text over HTTPS. And any kind of effort that's being undertaken like that, particularly with enterprise API audits, is going to require resources across all those teams. And that takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money. And it will oftentimes prevent teams from being able to get other things done. It might occupy themselves for a little period, a few weeks or something of dedicated time to go through and pull everything together and try to build some documentation for APIs that they know they have, that they've never documented, that they know they really need to. And so all of those initiatives have to be spun up, socialized, agreed upon, funded. It takes a lot of effort for enterprises to do that. And, it's definitely a valuable exercise for enterprises to undergo and a necessary step to get control and understanding of your API program, of your API surface area, to catalog everything, and then to encourage people to start using them. But that startup cost, there's a lot of friction that you will encounter. And so it's sometimes difficult to get it started or to get it all the way to completion. So either have to accept not having everything, but being able to do it in sections over time, by business unit, by line of business over time, or we have to accept that cost of getting caught up because we've let it go for so long.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, James. In fact, you've been talking about audit being much more of a manual process. So probably one line to explore there would be what's actually involved in an audit, or in your experience, do you see that there are any parts of an audit that has scope for automation?
Yeah, so a lot of the organizations I work with, they want to automate this process, and they've had a difficult time doing it. In some cases, I've seen, like a particular organization, they've spent months and months building up a spreadsheet of all their APIs, and they've kind of identified all of those APIs, but stood up their API catalog. So now they have a spreadsheet that's going stale. They don't have a live location or a live way of doing things, and to continually monitor and manage new APIs as they show up. They're kind of in that middle ground. It hasn't completely failed necessarily. It's just having a hard time being maintained. And they could benefit from some automation to be able to do that, so that not only do they find the APIs, even APIs that they weren't aware existed. Some development team decided maybe to split a service into two services. That's pretty common in the microservices world. You start with one service and you realize maybe it's getting a little too big and you split it. And they had the original documentation, but they failed to keep it updated. So now they've lost track of it. And the enterprise really needs to be able to keep track of that and to find those kinds of situations. So it can be difficult to maintain that, to find it. Automation is really key in that area. Some organizations I've seen have actually stood up things like third-party proxy servers, reverse proxy servers. They'll use things like Nginx or Apache just to watch logs and try to catch when new APIs start showing up. But it's kind of a manual process. They get a stream of logs. They have to kind of narrow that down, compare it to whatever catalog they have or spreadsheet that they have, and continually do that. And that can become a full-time job by several people to maintain. I've seen other situations where we have a lot of APIs that exist, but and they've done a good job of auditing and finding those initial APIs, but they haven't fully implemented the process to maintain their catalog. So the teams continually are deploying APIs, and their catalog is going stale as they continue forward. At some point, once they say, yes, we've kind of audited all of our network traffic, we've looked at everything, we found all the APIs, we found kind of those hidden APIs, we know that there's sprawl going on, we've kind of got a handle on it. Then a month goes by and all of a sudden they've lost track of it again because they haven't implemented those processes. They don't have ways to make sure that when APIs are built, we can find them, we can catalog them, we have a process to manage that.
Yeah, that sounds really right, James. In fact, I think we've covered some critical questions for the first half of our webinar today. I think now is an excellent time to dive into our first demo piece that I have prepared for us today. So we did talk quite a bit about API audit. What are the immediate value outcomes of driving an API audit? Why it's some of the roadblocks that we do face when it comes to conducting an enterprise audit strategy, namely getting an executive sponsorship, or it takes a lot of time away from critical resources, and they do have to take some time off on what they're some of the mission critical stuff that they are working on, and spend it on discovering the services that have already been built out, and just create a map and a model for all those services. So some of the key notes there that we had been trying to solve for at APIwiz was to create how to automate this process of API audit, and at the same time, how do we solve for some of the roadblocks? Because today, any enterprise audit, if we take a closer look at it, it could last anywhere from several months to even a couple of years in the most likely scenario. So what we're trying to do with APIwiz's audit as a service is picture a way in which you can capture a snapshot of your entire API ecosystem, and just without any code orchestration. Let's say we give you a program that you just enable on your VMs or servers, wherever you're hosting your microservices, containers, and it just gives you a snapshot of your entire API, saying that this is your overall API traffic, and these are the set of traffics that have been found to deviate against your open API specs. Also, a tally of all your zombie and shadow APIs. Now, this is of particular importance because when I say zombie APIs, I'm talking about those APIs that are have been deprecated, but they are still found to be hit inside your production runtime. And of course, we also have the other case of shadow APIs, which are pretty aggressive. They can be potentially harmful for an organization because not only is the functionality ambiguous, but there's no clear line of ownership, and no one really knows what the shadow APIs do. And they could really be unauthenticated for all we know, and they could pose a significant security concern for any organization. And that's also at the heart of the snapshot that we capture for your API program using APIwiz's API Audit, which really essentially captures the snapshot. And we also give a comprehensive report of the entire API audit by the resource level, saying for a specific resource, we found certain deviations, and could be something like a data type mismatch or an enum deviation in the place of integer, a string was passed. And it's not just at the level of design, but program owners are also concerned about things like security. Are there any OWASP security patterns found against my API traffic? It could just as well have a SQL injection attack. And that's exactly what's captured inside the audit report that we see over here. And of course, for the purpose of demo, I've just bookmarked a few key pages, but the actual enterprise audit report would be a really comprehensive one that will last anywhere from 400 to a couple of thousand pages as well. And essentially, it captures every single API, the known ones, the APIs that are zombie, and including even the APIs that are shadow. So having this entire audit report present, enterprises can make a more informed decision on where they want to go next with respect to their API program. And that's the key message that we do want to help enterprises out with, saying that API audit no longer has to be expensive. It doesn't have to be time consuming. And at the same time, you can capture your entire ecosystem without making any code orchestration changes, or just by enabling, it could be something as simple as a policy on your gateway. Or if you don't want to make any policy changes as well, you could just run one of our eBPF programs that we have developed in-house at APIwiz. So you just pop that in one of your VMs or all the servers in which are hosting your microservices and containers, and we'll capture that traffic for you. And we're going to generate this comprehensive API audit report. And this essentially serves as the base. So it's up to an enterprise now to use the results from this audit and say, now I want to remedy the situation, or how do I move towards remedy? If you have a lot of shadow APIs, it means that you have not cataloged your APIs enough and there's a lack of documentation. Or if you have a lot of zombie APIs being hit, it means that you have a lot of deprecated APIs that are still running, and they could pose a significant security threat or an organizational or regulatory threat. So these need to be corrected and rectified as well. So, and that's where we are moving with the API audit as well. Yeah, and that brings me to the end of the first piece of the demo. And I know I did mention about eBPF and the zero-touch observability, but I do have something also planned up for the second piece of the demo, which will come up in just a few minutes from now.
Yeah, in looking at this report, it sort of reminds me of one of my clients that had gone through an API audit. They went through a security audit. They were in a heavily regulated industry. And so they were doing their own self-audit of their APIs, and they realized they had about a dozen of them that weren't even managed by an API gateway. As they did some investigation, one, they realized there was no security whatsoever applied to them. So thankfully, they identified that. They identified through historical records and logs that no one had accessed those APIs that were unauthorized. So they caught it ahead of time. But what they did also find out is that some executives had used their role to override the standard governance processes and allow those APIs to go unmanaged and unmonitored. And so we had to do some corrective work, not only to start to monitor and manage those APIs. They were shadow APIs, and so they had identified that report, and found them, and then started to remediate the process. But they also realized that they had some education to do, so they had to go back and educate their staff, including their executives, to say, as important as some of these timelines might be, and that they might have been justified at that time to try to do that. in the end, it actually exposed the organization, thankfully, ahead of time. So having a report like this to be able to see how many APIs do I have, which ones are zombie or shadow APIs, which ones are producing a lot of traffic, which ones are deviating from our standards, which ones have had some API drift, meaning the implementation of the API has drifted from its documentation. They're a little bit different. So as you said, enums or just response or request payloads that have changed over time. So the documentation doesn't match what the API is actually doing and run at the runtime situation could cause support costs, could expose the API to different kinds of vulnerabilities. It could be that some developer didn't intentionally expose some sensitive data, but maybe in the process of trying to solve a problem, they said, well, I'll just throw this extra field in here. They didn't update the documentation. They didn't go through a design review, and the API is now exposing some sensitive data that it shouldn't be. So these kinds of reports would be valuable, and to be able to do it off of network traffic, like you're saying, and not having to do it manually, and to be able to catch those things that people may not even be aware of is key. One of the things that I actually see oftentimes is that organizations, as they reorg their structures, as people shift over to new roles, get promoted, move to another business line for a new opportunity, new people come in, those new people taking over that particular set of APIs may not be aware of some of the other APIs that were deployed, but not documented or cataloged in some way. So, it could be just something that is found that the manager of that area goes, wow, I didn't even know that was there. It must be left over from, a couple of years ago. So being able to find those APIs, to track them, to get a quick report on compliance, that's huge. And something that several of my clients could have benefited from, so they didn't spend months manually going through logs and looking at API, finding things deployed in different environments in their cloud infrastructure and going, wait, why is that there? And let's dig into this and let's go do some investigation. So that's huge. That report really shows me the opportunities that exist to get up and running with an audit quickly and to identify those APIs that may be out there that you don't know about, get them cataloged, get them managed, get them secured properly.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, James. In fact, I think we've been focusing on one half of today's focus topics, that was API audit. But I think as soon as I think of API audit, the other term that goes sort of almost hand in hand is the topic of observability. And when I think of audit, I also think of observability. So James, in terms of the second core topic of today's focus, which would be on API observability, what would you say are some of the key things that enterprises or large organizations generally look for in observability, in that traffic or out of an observability solution?
So a lot of the clients that I see, they use distributed log solutions to track what's going on and kind of troubleshoot their APIs and monitor the flow from service to service. So they'll oftentimes use things like the Elk stack or Splunk and other commercial offerings to track the traffic that's occurring between each of their API calls. So an API consumer calls an API. Maybe that API is talking to a few different services behind the scenes and gathering up data. And they'll use things like correlation IDs that are embedded in the headers to track all of those different requests and say that each of the service calls are related to that initial API call. That helps them to kind of observe what's going on and troubleshoot issues and just kind of generally figure out what's going on. And I've seen some organizations try to use that to understand workflow of services, what services are calling other services and building a dependency diagram so they kind of know, if I change the service, who am I going to be impacting? But a lot of times the SRE teams are really struggling with this because it's a lot of log entries to go through, and you can automate some of that. And we've seen a lot of automation in this world of observability, where we can take these logs and try to correlate them back. But there are a lot of situations where correlation IDs haven't even been implemented yet. So it's very, very difficult for them to track what's going on. The APIM world of New Relic and other kind of commercial and open source solutions to track requests through applications have been installed, but they can impact negatively your production systems. So it becomes something that they may only turn on in certain circumstances. So they may or may not actually have all of the details that they need to track down a problem and understand why are we having a significant increase in failures of this API or this particular service, or not even knowing which services a particular API is calling and orchestrating. So all of that to say that there's a lot of limited knowledge and ability to visualize what's going on in this distributed world we have today. A lot of organizations will stand up Lambdas and they'll have events and other things that they'll respond to, or they'll have little Lambda functions that are called in parallel sequentially from APIs to do checks and implement different kinds of business and routing and other kinds of orchestration and other needs that they might have. But it's very difficult for them to track all of that. And primarily the issue is, one, they don't have that catalog, so the auditing process still needs to occur. So they don't have kind of a location where they can have a list of all their APIs, what URLs they respond to, maybe even who owns them and how they're secured and so on. So it becomes very, very difficult for SRE teams to try to figure out, okay, why are we having this performance issue? Or we have a consumer that's saying that they're calling this API, but they keep encountering a 500 error and they're not sure why. And a team has to go in and try to figure that out. So a lot of that it's a difficult challenge for a lot of organizations today, particularly as more and more services start to be launched and deployed in cloud environments, and a single monolithic code base is being split apart into several different code bases. We have lots of network activity, lots of network traffic, and it's easy to lose track of what's going on.
Yeah, that's really right, James. In fact, it was very interesting when you mentioned that SRE teams are particularly finding it harder to, debug services, find out the root causes, and that usually takes anywhere from 6 to 8 hours today just to try to isolate the issue coming from a specific service or a workflow, or even once they find that out, they don't really know the core reason. So they have to get, developers on the call, find out, is it a data issue? Is it a system issue? Or is my network compromised? So there could be a lot of ways in which your API workflows are impacted. And just to get a visualization of, how the services are interlinked, when they're orchestrated, what are the dependencies that they make a call or they make use of. So having that visualization as a point of reference really makes a difference. And that also leads me to the next piece of demo that I've planned out today, which is the API tracing and observability on APIwiz, because part of the challenge that we did introduce an API monitoring and traffic capture via compliance dashboard on APIwiz, but what we felt is it's still pretty difficult for SRE teams to visualize the workflows, or any stakeholder across the lifecycle to really understand how my API is actually behaving in runtime. So just to capture that workflow in the actual runtime behavior, something that we did introduce quite recently was the API tracing and the zero-touch observability. Yeah. So on APIwiz, we have this API visualizer dashboard, which essentially captures your entire path in your runtime. Let's say, a typical enterprise today has a couple of services deployed on, one runtime. It could be a Kong. The customer experience APIs might be hosted off of Kong. Then you might have another layer of, the core business APIs that are hosted on Apigee. And you might have another set of microservices, which essentially call all your system APIs and your core systems at the back end. So that entire flow is very typical of an organization today, and the ability to visualize that data movement, like the incoming request comes from Kong, transitions over to Apigee, and then hits another microservice at the backend. So having this visual point of reference across your transactions, it really helps not just the SRE teams, but even the developers in QA to know that their APIs are actually functioning as they should be. And if you just inspect any one of these workflows, we can get a more detailed diagram of what is the path that your API followed in terms of every single transaction point, right from, and this is an example of a create loan request. So it could have originated from Kong, such as a create request. It goes to locate the customer's branch, check the consumer's credit history, and then do a couple of other validations across different runtimes. But the key to note here is that on APIwiz, it becomes really easy to capture not just the actual runtime flow, but the deviation in the path of your expected API workflow. And that's particularly interesting for SREs, QAs, and developers, because once they understand where the API is breaking, they can really lock in on what is the point that actually broke my API, or where did it generate the error, or what's the root cause of my issue, and what are the workflows that are impacted. So having this single visualization of the workflow, it really helps to capture that service map that you were referencing a bit earlier, as well as capturing how do my services actually deviated from the expected norm, as well as once you find out that point of error, you can start isolating it and even inspect some of the performance metrics that you see below. So you can see at each leg of the transaction, what caused the most number of milliseconds to get wasted in my request response. Where is the performance bottleneck? And this really helps you to optimize your workflow, or inspect if there's any issues found at hand as well.
Yeah, this is amazing. Actually, one anecdote that I had was I was actually talking to a client. They had one of their SRE team members came to me and said, we have this API that's taking about 5 to 10 seconds to complete, and we're not sure why it's so slow. How would you go about diagnosing this? And so I asked him, well, sounds like either if it's a standalone API and it's not calling you anything, then maybe you've got IO contention on the data source. Is it that? And no, our databases are fine. We already checked that out. They're responding quickly. They're not being overwhelmed. The IOPS are staying within our goals and everything. Okay, great. So then what's going on? Well, we think it's calling some services. Okay, well, what services is it supposed to be calling? We're not sure. And so the SRE had a bit of a disconnect from the team that actually built the solution. They didn't know what services were being called. And then they went in there and realized, well, it's calling each service in sequence. It's not parallelizing out the calls. Can you parallelize out some or all of these calls? Or do we have to wait for the response of the first service before we call the second? What kind of optimization? And so this kind of visualization is really powerful, because now the SRE can know what's supposed to occur. What is the sequence that's intended? Where did it deviate? Or if it is still following the same sequence we expect, where is it getting stuck at? What service is taking the most time, so we can dig into that and find out what's going on. Well, we also look at the calling client of each of the services and trying to figure out, can we parallelize some of these things out? Do we need to wait? Maybe it was a junior developer that built some of that code and they just kind of naively said, I'm going to call service A and then B and then C. And they didn't think about the fact that the total cost in time for that API to complete is the combination of A plus B plus C. And they didn't look for opportunities to parallelize that out. So that's really, really powerful. I am curious though, how would you define that flow that you would expect? What will you do that? Because your system has to know what the expected flow is. So how would you do something like that so that SRE has that information at hand and knows where maybe it called the wrong service or something else is built?
Yeah, that's a great question, James. In fact, if I just head over to the main landing page of APIwiz, so since we're following an API first culture, we want to ensure that for every new API or for any net new service that the organization is building out, they always define all the key drivers for that service first. So, and that also includes part of the service workflows as well. So within a particular organization, you might have tens of business units, and inside a business unit, you might have tens of services. And for that particular business unit, you might have n number of workflows that are present. So we give an option for really your program managers and your product owners to start defining what is that API workflow going to look like. So once you define it here, it becomes like a universal blueprint for your for your integration efforts to follow while you're building out those APIs and integrations. So we use this as the base reference to compare it in your actual runtime. So if there's any deviations, we'll know that this is what you've defined and this is what actually executed in your runtime. So there's a match or there's a deviation.
Okay. So this is a great way for the development team, the product owner, to be able to hand this off to the SRE team and say, here's what we're expecting. One of the other things you mentioned, we talked about time and performance and things. A lot of my clients are now starting to get a little bit more in their API programs. They're starting to define their SLAs or
all their non-functional requirements for their different APIs and services. So if I'm going to use this service, I need to make sure that it's going to fit within an SLA that I can handle as the person going to be consuming and reusing that service. So I get reuse, but do I have the confidence that I'm going to be able to reuse something that's going to perform at the level that I expect? And so now you're showing me also in that governance dashboard, I can define all those metrics. I can define the workflows. Now my SRE team has something that they can track against. That's really powerful. I've seen organizations trying to capture SLA details in their catalogs, but they didn't have any way to really action it unless they built a lot of work. They did a lot of work themselves to audit check, take that number out of the catalog, compare it against real-time data, and tell them they deviate from it, report on it. And this is for a client that has thousands and thousands of developers, so they can throw a few developers at it and kind of automate that workflow for themselves. This lets anybody. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it certainly is, James. It was a really exciting day, and I think we covered some of the really critical questions on why enterprises really struggle with their, getting service discoverability. We talked about the getting executive sponsorship, the really time and resources that it takes away to do an API audit, and how we can automate it using APIwiz's audit as a service and generate that report, which really captures a snapshot of your ecosystem. And finally, we also covered a bit, on the terms that go hand to hand along with audit, which is the observability. And we talked about how enterprises handle observability today, how the SRE teams really debug those issues today, and what are some of the challenges that they face, particularly in visualizing the services, dependencies, and how they're really orchestrated within the grander API program and those scheme of things. And what we also covered was, how do you visualize those workflows and enforce a sort of a workflow governance that really helps enterprises move in the right direction from an API first approach, define your key program drivers, workflows, stakeholders, the key API artifacts, and finally you go ahead towards building after you're defined and designed all your constructs over there. So I think that, that was a very good session, James. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today, James. I'm sure the audience has really enjoyed our session today. And one of the key things, of course, is we do love all your questions, comments, feedbacks, and suggestions. So do send us an email at info@apiwiz.com. Let us know what you thought of today's webinar. Thank you all for joining. Today was a really good session. And until next time, cheers. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you, Adib, and thanks everybody for joining.